It was early morning in Los Angeles, the kind of pale light that makes a room feel like memory. Through half-drawn blinds, dust drifted and glimmered above a desk crowded with old scripts, creased pages marked by pencil, coffee rings, and a lifetime of notes in a tight hand. Al Pacino sat in a low chair by the window, shoulders slightly bent, eyes following the slow, bright crawl of daylight across the floorboards, as if time itself were crossing the room to meet him. On one wall, photographs. A young man with volcanic eyes. Stages, street corners, faces he had loved. Premiere nights and small, unguarded moments in kitchens at 2 a.m. He looked from picture to picture, and the old fire rose, then softened. "You can spend your whole life chasing truth in front of an audience," he murmured, "and still miss the truth sitting across the table from you." He reached for a script and didn't open it. His hands, which had learned to speak before words did, rested quietly on the cover. The quiet felt heavier than it used to. In that hush, he could hear the things that applause once drowned out. The click of a clock, a distant siren, an unanswered question that had followed him from set to set. "I kept thinking there'd be more time," he said, almost to the light. "Another season, another take, one more chance to get it right." He let the thought hang, then added softer, "But you don't rehearse the important scenes? You live them, or you miss them." He stood, paced 2 careful steps, and smiled a small, private smile. The kind a man wears when he's finally ready to say something that costs him. "There is one thing," he admitted, voice low, steady, untheatrical. "One thing I wish I could change before it's too late." The room seemed to lean in. Outside, a palm frond brushed the glass. He looked past his reflection to the thin blue of morning, and for the first time in years, chose not to play a part. He chose to tell the truth. Before the lights, before the applause, before the legend, there was a boy from East Harlem who lived in a room so small he could hear his mother breathe in the dark. Alfredo James Pacino was born in 1940 to Sicilian parents who loved but could not stay together. His father left when he was 2. His mother, Rose, raised him alone in the Bronx, working endless hours to keep the lights on. The walls were thin, the winters colder than they should have been, and dreams, those wild, cinematic dreams, felt like something that belonged to other people. He was shy, restless, and angry. Teachers called him difficult. He called himself invisible. The streets taught him more than school ever could: how to fight, how to hide, and how to watch people's faces for truth. He later said that everything he learned about acting came from those sidewalks, watching broken men laugh too loudly, lovers argue in doorways, mothers hold their children like shields. It was theater, he once said, except no one knew they were performing. He found escape in the dark. Movie theaters became his churches. He would sit for hours, letting the silver light wash over him. James Dean, Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift. They were more than stars. They were proof that a man could scream, hurt, love, and still be beautiful doing it. He wanted that. He wanted to speak the language of pain and be heard. But at home, silence ruled. His mother rarely complained, but her exhaustion was a sermon of its own. When she died suddenly while he was still in his 20s, Pacino was crushed. "She never saw me make it," he once said quietly. "Everything I became too late." That wound never closed. It only changed shape, showing up in the characters he played. The haunted eyes, the soft tremor in his voice before rage took over. His early years were a collection of near misses, rejections, cheap rooms, hunger. He slept on floors, worked odd jobs, and auditioned until his voice went raw. But the hunger, the one he carried since childhood, never left. It wasn't for fame. It was for meaning, for proof that he mattered in a world that had passed him by. He later told a friend, "Acting saved me because it gave me permission to feel everything I'd been told to hide." That was the root of his pain and his genius. He didn't just perform emotion, he resurrected it. But what he couldn't yet know was that the same fire that rescued him from obscurity would one day burn him in silence. For every applause that filled his ears, there was a part of that little boy from the Bronx still waiting, still listening for the sound of his mother's voice, and that silence and never stopped echoing. When Al Pacino first stepped onto a stage in the 1960s, it was not yet fame he was chasing, it was oxygen. The theater gave him what the world had denied: space to exist, to rage, to weep. Under the dim lights of small New York stages, he found the closest thing to freedom. He once said, "The stage doesn't lie. You either live or you disappear." And for a young man who had spent years unseen, disappearing was no longer an option. By the early 70s, everything began to shift. The Panic at Needle Park put his name in conversations. The Godfather made him immortal. Suddenly, the boy who once stood outside movie theaters could see his own face on the posters. But what the world saw as destiny, he saw as a strange accident. A shy, damaged kid now living inside characters who screamed louder than he ever could. On screen, Pacino burned. His voice, sharp as glass, could turn into a whisper that broke hearts. When Michael Corleone said, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in," it wasn't just a line. It was prophecy. The world pulled him in again and again, feeding his hunger and deepening his solitude. He worked like a man possessed. Every role was a battle, every scene a confession. He wanted truth, not perfection, not beauty, just the truth, raw and trembling. It was what made his performances unforgettable, but it also made his life unbearable. Between takes, he rarely spoke. He would stay in character for days, unable to find his way back. "The camera is merciless," he once said. "It sees the part of you you'd rather keep hidden." That part, the broken boy, the lonely man, became the source of his brilliance and his torment. The 80s were a blur of success and exhaustion. Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Scarface. Each role took something from him. He gave more than he had, and the applause became both a reward and a curse. He was admired, adored, envied, but rarely understood. Behind the fierce eyes and the volcanic energy, there was a man still unsure whether he deserved any of it. In interviews, he often joked, masking truth behind laughter. "I'm not acting. I'm just trying to survive up there." But survival had its cost. Fame devoured his privacy, love eluded him, and peace, the thing he had searched for all his life, stayed just out of reach. He once admitted, "I've played men who lose their souls so many times, I started to wonder if I'd misplaced mine somewhere along the way." And yet, the fire refused to die. Each new film reignited something primal, that Bronx hunger, that need to make pain meaningful. To the world, Al Pacino was a master of his craft. To himself, he was still rehearsing the role of being human. Because for him, the performance was never about pretending. It was about remembering. Every scream, every silence, every tear on screen was a message to the boy who once watched the world from behind the glass. You are seen now. By the time the new century began, Al Pacino had everything the world said a man should want: fame, legacy, money, admiration. And yet, in the quiet moments between projects, he began to feel an unfamiliar emptiness. It was as though the lights he had chased his whole life had finally gone out, and all that remained was the echo of applause fading into silence. The roles came slower now. He became selective, almost hesitant, not because the fire was gone, but because he feared what the fire had already taken. "I used to think acting saved me," he told a friend. "Now I'm not so sure it didn't consume me." His days grew smaller, quieter. He would rise late, make coffee, wander his house lined with books and scripts. On some mornings, he would read old notes from directors long gone: Lumet, Coppola, De Palma, each one a ghost whispering from another life. The once busy set was replaced by stillness. He didn't hate the silence. He simply didn't know what to do with it. There were failed relationships, long nights of insomnia, moments when even conversation felt like performance. The man who had once commanded rooms now sat in the back corner of restaurants, unnoticed, almost relieved. He was still working, still brilliant, but there was a distance in his eyes, as if part of him had already stepped off stage. He once said, half smiling, half serious, "I've played so many lonely men, I started to wonder if I was auditioning for myself." The truth was harsher than the joke. His life had become a series of masks, not out of vanity, but survival. The audience saw passion. He felt fatigue. They saw power. He felt loss. In interviews, he talked about art, about legacy, about cinema. But what he never said was how much he missed being ordinary. He confessed to a close friend one evening, "I don't remember the last time someone looked at me without seeing him. The actor, the legend. I just want someone to look at me and see Al." That longing, simple, human, haunted him more than age or illness ever could. He wasn't sick in body, he was weary in soul. Every performance, every award, every ovation had built a wall so tall that no one could climb it, not even him. There were whispers of depression, but he refused the word. "I'm not sad," he said once. "I'm just empty in places I used to be full." He began writing again, not for film, but for himself. Notes, reflections, confessions. One page simply read, "You become what the world needs you to be, and one day you forget what you were before they needed you." He reread that line often, and with each reading, it became less of an observation and more of a truth. The actor who had defined American cinema was beginning to understand the cost of becoming immortal. It was loneliness, wrapped in applause. And yet, even in that silence, there was something tender, almost redemptive. When he taught young actors, he told them, "Don't act to be remembered. Act to feel alive. The rest is noise." Those words carried the wisdom of a man who had seen every kind of spotlight and had learned that all of them eventually fade. The legend remained. The man beneath it waited. And somewhere deep inside, Al Pacino began to sense that his story wasn't about success or failure anymore. It was about forgiveness, the kind that has nothing to do with the world and everything to do with the mirror. In the last few years, Al Pacino began to slow his pace, not because he wanted to retire, he never would, but because he felt time watching him. The hands that once gestured with fury and fire now moved slower, deliberate, like a conductor nearing the final movement of his symphony. He still read scripts, still went to sets, still laughed when the camera rolled. But in the quiet between takes, his gaze would drift somewhere far away. Not to the past he'd lived, but to the moments he'd missed. One late evening, during an interview in his home, he was asked if he had any regrets. For a long time he didn't answer. Then in a whisper that trembled like old film, he said, "I wish I'd been braver when it came to love." The room went still. He looked down at his hands, fingers folded together like a prayer. "I gave everything to the work," he continued, "and the work gave me the world. But what I didn't realize was, you can hold the world in your hands and still have empty arms." He paused. "That's what I'd change if I could. I'd tell the people I love that I love them. Not through performances, not through gestures, but with words, with presence." There was no bitterness in his tone, only the kind of quiet acceptance that arrives when a man has wrestled too long with himself. He wasn't confessing a sin, he was confessing humanity. In recent years, his health had grown fragile and the solitude deeper. Friends said he spent long afternoons sitting by the window, watching the light move across the room. He would hum old opera tunes, sometimes quote Shakespeare, and often, he wrote in his journal, pages filled not with roles or memories, but gratitude. One note written just months before read, "I used to think happiness was applause. Now I know it's silence, when you can finally hear your own heart without the noise." Another entry said, "If I could live again, I'd choose to love louder and work less." For a man whose name defined intensity, these words revealed a gentleness the world had rarely seen. He told a friend, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving too many things unsaid." That fear became his final lesson, that greatness means little if it isn't shared in tenderness. In his final public appearance, Al Pacino stood before a small crowd at a film retrospective. His hair was white, his voice rougher, but his presence was still unmistakable. When the applause began, he raised his hand slightly, not to accept it, but to quiet it. And then he said with a faint smile, "Don't clap for me. Clap for the time we've all had together. The films, the moments, the dreams. That's the real show." The audience stood in silence. It wasn't the end of a career. It was a benediction. Back home that night, he sat by the window, where the Los Angeles skyline stretched out like a reel of fading film. The moonlight touched his face, and he whispered softly to himself, "Maybe this is what peace looks like. Not applause, not victory, just understanding." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled. Not the smile of a performer, but of a man who had finally forgiven the boy from the Bronx for wanting too much and giving too little. In the stillness, he thought of his mother, of the lovers who once waited for him, of the friends he'd lost to time. And then, almost inaudibly, he said one last thing, words not meant for anyone but himself. "Tell them I finally learned how to love." And in that moment, the city outside continued to hum. Cars, wind, faint laughter, as if the world itself was keeping him company for one final night. When the news of his passing quietly broke, there were no headlines screaming, no grand farewell tour, no spectacle, just a wave of stillness. Hollywood paused, not out of shock but reverence. The man who had once filled the screen with rage, love, and defiance had left it in silence. Friends and former co-stars spoke softly of him. "He wasn't just an actor," one said. "He was truth in human form." Another whispered, "He didn't perform emotions. He bled them." But perhaps the truest words came from a young student who had met him briefly at a workshop years before. "He looked at me like he already knew who I was, and for that 1 second, I felt seen." That was his real gift. Not fame, not fortune, but presence. He made people feel visible in a world that moves too fast to notice. His funeral was simple, held on a hill overlooking the Pacific. No cameras, no red carpets, just a few loved ones, a few friends, a soft wind. Someone read Shakespeare. "Our revels now are ended." Someone else read his own words, written long ago in his notebook. "I don't want to be remembered for being great. I want to be remembered for being real." And perhaps that's how he'll remain. Not as an untouchable icon, but as a man who spent his life searching for truth, even when it hurt to look for it. In the years that followed, his performances were rediscovered, studied not just for craft, but for humanity. Viewers said they could feel something alive in his silences, something that went beyond acting, something that was simply Al. His home remains filled with sunlight. On his desk, the old notebook still lies open, a pen resting on the last line he ever wrote. "The only thing that lasts is what you give away." That perhaps was his final confession, that art, like love, only becomes eternal when it is shared. Today, when the light flickers across a theater screen, someone somewhere still gasps at that voice, those eyes, that quiet intensity. And in that gasp, that sudden ache of recognition, he lives again. Because legends fade, but truth doesn't. And Al Pacino's truth was never about power or success or applause. It was about the fragile, furious beauty of being human. In the end, he didn't need to change the world. He just needed to forgive himself for not being perfect. And maybe that quiet act of grace, is what truly remains.